I never thought that owning a couple of rainwater tanks would turn me into the most hated person in Maplewood Estates. Or, at least, hated by one very particular person, Karen, the legendary HOA enforcer. It was a sunny Saturday morning, birds chirping, kids running around the park, and the community garden thriving under a canopy of tomato plants, cucumbers, and a suspiciously overachieving pumpkin patch. And there, at the corner of my backyard, stood my pride and joy, two massive rainwater tanks, gleaming in the sun, silently collecting the life-giving rain that would eventually nourish the garden. I'd invested months in setting up the system. Every gutter, pipe, and valve was meticulously aligned, and I'd even added a small solar-powered pump to keep the water flowing to the garden. I thought of it as my gift to the community, a little oasis of sustainability in an otherwise HOA-obsessed suburban jungle. Apparently, Karen saw it differently. It started with a polite note slipped under my door. "Dear Mr. Carter, your rainwater tanks appear to be in violation of HOA aesthetic guidelines. Please remove or relocate them immediately." HOA Karen, I read it, blinked and muttered. "Violation. They're saving water, and the garden depends on them." Rusty, my loyal dog, gave an approving woof. I ignored the note. Honestly, Karen's obsession with community guidelines was becoming almost entertaining. Little did I know, ignoring her was about to trigger the greatest suburban disaster Maplewood Estates had ever seen. A week later, it happened. I was working on my laptop in the shade when I heard the unmistakable crunch of boots on gravel. Looking up, I saw Karen striding toward the tanks with a determined glare, clipboard in hand, flanked by two HOA volunteers carrying heavy-duty tarps. "Mr. Carter," she called out, voice sharp as a whip. "I've decided that these tanks must be removed immediately. They are an eyesore and violate community aesthetics. Consider this enforcement action." I blinked. You can't just remove them without my permission." Karen smiled, a smile that suggested she had already mentally won some imaginary battle. "Watch me." Before I could react, she and her minions started unfastening the tanks, tipping them slightly to roll them toward the street. I jumped up, heart racing. "Wait. Those tanks, the community garden depends on them," I shouted. Karen paused, squinting at me. "Community garden. What?" I realized she hadn't considered the consequences of her actions. My tanks were not just water storage, they were life support for the communal plants that fed half the neighborhood. By mid-afternoon, the tanks were lying in the driveway, half-emptied and ready to be hauled off. And that's when the chaos began. The garden wilted almost instantly. Tomatoes drooped, cucumbers sagged, and even the pumpkin patch looked betrayed. Neighbors started showing up, horrified at the sight, demanding answers. "Who did this?" Mrs. Thompson cried, hands on her hips. I think it was Karen," I muttered, pointing in the general direction of the clubhouse. "Karen." The words traveled fast. Soon, a small crowd had formed. Whispers escalated into shouts. The HOA Karen tank disaster, as it would later be called, was underway. Karen, unaware of the growing storm of public outrage, marched back to the clubhouse, confident she had enforced the rules. Meanwhile, I realized something important. She had no idea the full consequences of her actions, and I was about to make her regret it. The rainwater tanks are gone, thanks to Karen's overzealous enforcement. The community garden is wilting, and neighbors are noticing. Karen is oblivious to the damage she caused. I, the protagonist, am realizing that this is my moment to fight back, with clever strategy, neighborhood support, and a little poetic justice. The morning after Karen's tank-dumping fiasco, Maplewood Estates was buzzing like an angry beehive. Word spread faster than a wildfire. The HOA had literally destroyed the water supply for the community garden. I could hear snippets of conversations as I walked Rusty around the block. "Did you see the tomatoes?" Mrs. Thompson gasped. "They're wilting." I thought the HOA was supposed to manage things, not destroy them. Mr. Patel shouted from his porch. Even kids noticed. A group of them ran past, pointing at the empty driveway where my tanks had been, chanting something about water thieves and Karen's revenge. The drama had officially hit full force. I knew Karen had underestimated one thing, the power of consequences she hadn't calculated. She might have thought she was enforcing rules, but she had just created a miniature suburban apocalypse. And I had front row seats to watch the panic unfold. By mid-morning, the phone calls started. Neighbors were calling me directly, frustrated and desperate. Can you save the garden? Mrs. Thompson begged over the phone. I might have an idea, I said carefully, weighing my options. Rusty wagged his tail as if to say, yes, it's time. Karen, oblivious to the chaos, was holding an emergency HOA meeting at the clubhouse. I could hear the distant shouting through the trees. Rules are rules. We can't just let this slide. Meanwhile, volunteers and board members scrambled to explain why the garden had wilted, but no one could quite admit it was because Karen had dumped my tanks. Admitting that would be political suicide. Across the street, Mr. Peterson, my unofficial co-conspirator and retired mischief maker, winked at me. She has no idea what she's done, he said. I nodded. That was the beauty of it. Karen had walked straight into a scenario where her obsession with rules collided with reality. By noon, the neighborhood's mood had shifted. People started taking sides openly. Team Garden. Residents who supported me, upset about the destroyed water supply. They quietly cheered me on, offering hoses, buckets, and sympathy. Team Karen. A few loyal HOA volunteers who still believed in the righteousness of her mission, trying to defend her decisions. The spectators, most of the neighborhood, standing on porches, whispering, and waiting to see what would happen next. It was chaos, and I loved every second of it. By mid-afternoon, I decided it was time to act. The tanks themselves were still in my driveway, barely emptied. I knew I could leverage this to restore water to the garden, but only on my terms. I sent out a neighborhood message. Attention residents, the community garden will be restored to full health tomorrow, but only if the HOA admits their mistake and stops interfering in personal property. Details to follow. The message spread like wildfire. By evening, Karen was in a full panic. She called me directly, voice shaking. Mr. Carter. This is unacceptable. You can't dictate terms to the HOA. Karen, I said calmly, I'm not dictating.
I'm negotiating.
And the garden, like all good things, depends on careful management. You might want to take notes. There was silence on the other end of the line, followed by muttered threats and the clicking of a hung-up phone. By nightfall, the neighborhood was buzzing with gossip, and I realized something important. Karen had created her own problem. And in her obsession with control, she had handed me a unique opportunity to expose the flaws in her rule-heavy HOA logic, all while saving the garden and proving a point about respecting personal property. The next morning, the sun rose over Maplewood Estates like nothing had happened, but I knew better. Karen never sleeps. Or at least, she never sleeps when there's perceived non-compliance in her jurisdiction. By 8 a.m., I noticed a flurry of activity near the clubhouse. Karen had gathered a small army of HOA volunteers, each armed with clipboards, measuring tapes, and the sort of grim determination usually reserved for apocalypse scenarios. From my porch, I sipped coffee, Rusty lying at my feet, ears perked. Today would be interesting. Her first tactic was surveillance intimidation. Volunteers staked out my property, pretending to inspect the tanks while secretly hoping I'd make a mistake. One volunteer even tried to measure the distance between the tanks and my fence, mumbling about community safety compliance. I waved cheerfully and held up a measuring tape of my own, exaggerating every number for comedic effect. Karen, noticing my antics, turned red with fury. She stormed toward me, clipboard flailing like a flag of war. Mr. Carter. This is unacceptable. You are violating HOA regulations by what? I wasn't sure, but she was flustered, and that was all that mattered. I smiled calmly. By ensuring the community garden survives, Karen. Do you want me to show you how? Her jaw dropped. Volunteers whispered to one another. Rusty barked once, as if punctuating the moment. Next, Karen attempted psychological warfare. She sent a letter to every neighbor, Attention residents. Mr. Carter's rainwater tanks are in violation of HOA property guidelines. Use caution when approaching his property. Safety of the community is a priority. The irony was delicious. Instead of intimidating me, she had inadvertently made me the hero. Neighbors began showing up with hoses, watering cans, and questions about how they could help save the garden. Mr. Peterson even brought a small wheelbarrow full of compost. The more Karen tried to assert her authority, the more the neighborhood rallied in my favor. By mid-afternoon, it was clear she had underestimated the power of community goodwill. Karen's final tactic that day was perhaps the most ambitious. She attempted an emergency tank confiscation drill at the clubhouse, inviting volunteers to simulate removing rainwater systems. It was essentially a theatrical rehearsal of her fantasy of control. I watched from my porch, sipping coffee, Rusty at my side. The parade of volunteers looked ridiculous, tripping over hoses and arguing over imaginary safety procedures. Karen barked orders like a drill sergeant, but chaos reigned supreme. At one point, she turned to a volunteer and shouted, "We must stop Mr. Carter from interfering with our HOA authority." I stepped out, smiling sweetly. "Karen, if you'd like, I can demonstrate proper rainwater system maintenance for the entire HOA. Consider it a learning opportunity." Her eyes widened. The volunteers froze. For once, Karen realized she was not in control. By evening, the community garden was back on track. I had restored water flow using the tanks, still in my driveway, while Karen was left to stew in her frustration. Neighbors whispered, chuckled, and even took photos of the debacle. Rumors began circulating that Mr. Carter outsmarted HOA Karen again. Rusty wagged his tail as if to say, another victory for Team Garden. Karen escalated with surveillance, letters, and theatrical drills, leveraged her overreach to gain neighborhood support. The garden was saved, reinforcing my role as the community hero.